Matthew chapter 15. We'll be looking at verses 29 to 39 this morning.
Can we bring back the cute face? The cute little face?
Now, the cute face went to the other room. He's starting to get grumpy because he's ready for bed. She'll be zooming through here about in a couple of minutes. She'll probably stop by to put the cute face back on again. All right, Matthew 15. So I actually want to start in the middle at verse 32 and just read the first part of that. It says, now Jesus called his disciples to himself and said, I have compassion on the multitude. And we'll see there we move into the feeding of the 4,000. But the point I want to make here is this whole section really is about the Lord's compassion, showing one of the characteristics that God has. And what's interesting is, I went back and in the Old Testament, it talks about God's compassion over and over and over. We often think of the Old Testament as, where God judges everyone, but he talks about the prophets talk about his compassion over and over. You'll remember things like in Lamentations, it says his compassions fail not, right? In Isaiah, it talks about the Lord is rising up to show compassion. And then in the New Testament, we see the same thing. You'll probably remember from Romans chapter 9, it talks about God says, I will have mercy on whom I will have mercy, and I will have compassion on whom I will have compassion. And then here in Matthew, we've also seen his compassion several times. Go back to Matthew chapter 9. Matthew chapter 9, verse 36. Right, it says, but when he saw the multitudes, he was moved with compassion for them because they were weary and scattered like a sheep having no shepherd. And we just recently saw it in chapter 14. Chapter 14, verse 14. It says, and when Jesus went out, he saw a great multitude, and he was moved with compassion for them, and he healed their sick. So when we talk about compassion, it really is more than just feeling sorry for someone. It's feeling sorry plus action, right? It's really doing something about it. And that's what we see when Jesus has compassion. There's always action associated with it. Now, having gotten you into a compassionate mode, I want to admit something to you. And that is that I made at least 3 errors last week in teaching the lesson. It may be 4, but at least 3. I want to go through the first one right here, and then we'll pick up the rest of them because it impacts this lesson today that we get some of these things correct. Let me also say before I get into that is some of these you should have picked up on, and maybe you did. If you did, and you sat there going, gee, Rich really messed up there. I really wish he would have said something rather than just let it slide. So when you, please, if you see me make a mistake, it's way more important that people get the right information than that I don't get embarrassed or something. So anyway, so the first one has to do with the lesson last week. We talked about the Canaanite woman. And I went on to talk about the Canaanite woman, saying that the Canaanites were those were the people that were in the land that when Daniel was taken off to Babylon, they intermarried with the people there, and they became half-breeds, and this is why the Jews hated them so much. That's a great description. However, it's a great description of the Samaritans, not the Canaanites. So that was just wrong. And frankly, when I taught it Monday night, somebody said, gee, that sounds a lot like the Samaritans. And then I realized, oh, I just had the 2 groups mixed up. Yes, that's the Samaritans. So the Canaanites, let's take a minute and make sure we understand who they are. I want you to go back all the way to Genesis. Go ahead and turn there. It's one of those things that, was fuzzy in my head until I went back and looked at it. So it may be fuzzy in yours. Back to Genesis chapter 9. So the question is, the Canaanites obviously are people from Canaan. But the question is, where does even Canaan get its name from? And if you look at Genesis chapter 9, verse 20, we have here a story about Noah. It says in Noah, in Genesis 9:20, and Noah began to be a farmer, and he planted a vineyard. Then he drank the wine and was drunk and became uncovered in his tent, i.e., he was naked, running around in his tent. And Ham, who was the son of Noah, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father and told his two brothers outside, the two brothers of Canaan. But Shem and Japheth took a garment and laid it on both their shoulders and went backwards and covered the nakedness of their father. Their faces were turned away, and they did not see their father's nakedness. So Noah awoke from his wine and knew what his younger son had done to him. Now, when he says younger son, in the Old Testament, when they use the word son, it also can be grandson or great-grandson. And here he's talking about Canaan. And so it goes on in verse 24. So Noah awoke from his wine, knew what his younger son had done to him, and said, "Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants. He shall be to his brethren." He said, "Blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem, and may Canaan be his servant. May God enlarge Japheth, and may he dwell in the lands of Shem, and may Canaan be his servant." So we hear his Canaan was actually a real person. He was the grandson of Noah, who went in and saw the nakedness of his grandfather and was cursed because of that. And as we go through, I actually want to show you two maps today. I'm going to do all kinds of things I've never done before. First, admit that I was completely wrong, but then show you a couple of things. Let me, if I can figure out how to do this. Why can't I figure out how to do this?
Stephanie wants to know if you're going to drop the map of the Lake of Galilee.
I've done such a good job with it in the past, haven't I? Why can't I? How do I share on this thing? I've done it before.
You have a share button at the top right by login.
Wait a minute. There's a little boy coming through
Oh.
while I'm doing this.
Next to
I found the share button. Thanks. Here he is.
Hi, Jackson.
Wave to everybody. He's like, "What, everybody? I don't see anything."
Hi.
All right, that's enough. He's ready for bed. Bye.
Hopefully.
Hi.
Ready for
Hi. Hi.
All right, hold on. I figured it out. Let me do that, and then I'll do this. Then I'll go back and do this, and then I do that. See, that's how easy this is.
Says share right there below the little. That's.
Yeah.
You see any maps?
Yeah.
All right, good.
Good
Here's the
timing.
first map.
These now.
Can you see this all right? Is it big enough?
Yep.
So this is Abraham, right? He starts out here in Ur, right? He's from the land of Ur. He travels. He ends up down here notice that it says in the land of Canaan. So when Canaan got in trouble with Noah, he sent him away and he gave him this land here. West is the Dead Sea. Here's the Sea of Galilee. I don't need to draw it. But all this land in the west of the Dead Sea was Canaan. And this is actually where Abraham lived for most of his life. He lived in this area of Canaan. In fact, all the stories we have about him, going up on the mountain with his son and his son, going off to distant lands to get wives, right? All of that occurred in here. He did go into Egypt, which is down over here, for a little while, because you'll remember that he had a slave named Hagar, who was an Egyptian slave. So he did go down in there. That's what the little arrow means. But he actually lived in Hebron and Bethel and Beersheba. You'll see in the Old Testament, you'll see reference to all those things. In this area is where he was. So that is our good friend Abraham. Now I'm going to go back to the other view. I could stop sharing. All right. Now you should see me again, right?
Yep.
So I want you to see, so Abraham lived in Canaan, all his life. He actually was buried in Canaan. But you remember that the Jews actually ended up in Egypt. Do you remember how that happened? How'd they end up in Egypt? This is a quiz.
Famine?
Can't hear you.
Famine?
Joseph.
Some guy named Joseph, right?
Yeah.
Right. There were the 12 sons, right? And they sold Joseph into slavery into Egypt. Then there was the famine. Come on now, guys, right? You remember all these stories. There was the famine. He got all of his brothers and his father eventually to come to Egypt, and they lived in Egypt. And then, at the end of the story, they say, finally Joseph died. And the new king that came into being didn't know who Joseph was. He decided that these Israelites were a real problem in Egypt and converted them all to being slaves, which sets us up for Moses and what he does, right? So this is just reminding you of history, what's going on, so you can remember who the Canaanites were. But again, it was this area where, where Moses spent most of his life and most of the ministry that we know about. Was in this land called Canaan. Now, but obviously they were the people of Canaan, not Abraham, but the people that lived in Canaan worshipped other gods, right? They were polytheistic, but they also, one of the gods they worshipped, you'll remember perhaps, is this god called Molech. Molech was the god that they sacrificed babies to. There was a big brass statue. They would put a fire in the bottom of it, and then they would lay the babies on top of the hot brass statue. Yeah, fun guy. But anyway, that's all back in Leviticus chapter 18. It talks about the evil wickedness of the Canaanites. So when so after Moses took them out of Egypt, right, and they were in the wilderness. And they went and spied out the land of Canaan, right? They sent the 12 spies. 2 came back, said go. 10 said don't go. And he then sent them into the land of Canaan to take it over because of their wickedness. There's an interesting passage. I do want to show it to you. Go to Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy chapter 9. And I know we're off subject here, but I learned some things, and so you should learn some things. Deuteronomy chapter 9. Deuteronomy chapter 9, verse 1, actually. Let's read a little bit. It says, "Hear, O Israel, you have crossed over the Jordan today, and go in and dispossess nations greater and mightier than yourselves, cities great and fortified up to heaven. The people great and tall, the descendants of the Anakim," right, these giants who you know and whom you heard. It said, "Who can stand before the descendants of Anak? Therefore understand today that the Lord your God is he who goes over before you. As a consuming fire, he will destroy them and bring them down before you. So you shall drive them out and destroy them quickly, as the Lord has said to you." Now, I just want to stop there and just say, right, he's sending them in because of the evil that is being done in Canaan. But look at verse 4. I love this part. It says, "Do not think in your heart after the Lord your God has cast them out before you, saying, because of my righteousness the Lord has brought me in to possess this land, but it's because of the wickedness of these nations that the Lord is driving them out before you." Verse 5, "It is not because of your righteousness or the uprightness of your heart that you go in to possess their land, but because of the wickedness of these nations that the Lord your God drives them out from before you, that he may fulfill the word which the Lord swore to your fathers of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob." Verse 6, "Therefore understand that your Lord your God is not giving you this land to possess because of your righteousness, for you are a stiff-necked people." Three times, right? He tells them, this is not because you're so wonderful and so incredible, and because we've taken, because you've done some great things, it's because these people are wicked that we're doing this. And it just so reminds me, right? Why has God done the things for us that he has done for us? not because we're so wonderful and he thinks we're so great and he thinks we're so righteous, right? He thinks we're a stiff-necked people. It's because of his graciousness and because of who he is that he's done these things for us. And this goes all the way back to that time. Anyway, so here we see then the people coming in, taking over the land of Canaan, and wiping out the religious works that were being done in that place. So taking us now back to last week's lesson, then we see there is still some people who were Canaanites, who used to be in that land before Israel came in and essentially wiped out what was going on. And this is the woman that we talked about last week, who came to Jesus and wanted her to heal her daughter. All right, so you got now who the Canaanites are? We good? We good with Canaanites? All right. So now we got to go on to the lesson today and show you the second problem. So verse 29 says, Jesus departed from there, skirted the Sea of Galilee, and went up on the mountain and sat down there. So Jesus departed from there. Where was there? Where did he depart from? Where were we last week?
Matthew.
Where were we last week?
The
Capernaum?
region of Tyre and Sidon.
Tyre and Sidon, right, very good. Now, if you go to Mark chapter 7, we have the parallel passage, and it gives us a little bit more information that helps us figure out this travel that Jesus is making in chapter 7, Mark chapter 7, verse 31. And just stay there because I'm gonna show you something else while we're there. But go to Mark 7:31. And it says, again, departing from the region of Tyre and Sidon, he came through the midst of the region of the Decapolis to the Sea of Galilee. Now, one of the other mistakes I made last week was that I said when he went up to Tyre and Sidon, that was part of the Decapolis. Well, that was just, again, wrong. I'll show you my second map. See, we're just all about maps today. Figure out how to share again. There it is. There it is. Somewhere there's a map. There we go. This map. So, can you see that okay?
It's small.
I'm not sure how to make it any bigger.
But I see.
Whoa.
That looked too scary. We're not going to do that. All right. You don't have to know the details. I just want to show you something. So here's the Sea of Galilee in the middle, right? That's where we have spent most of our time. What if I can blow this up somehow? Whoa. Is that better?
No.
Oh, yes.
There you go.
Yeah.
Okay.
Tire and Sidon.
Point up
All
with
right,
your
see,
There you
right,
go. Point to the direction.
point up with your right finger. Do
does this
that.
work? All right. So here's the Sea of Galilee in the middle, right? Capernaum, we've talked about. That's where Peter lived. That's where Jesus has done most of the ministry that we've talked about before. Here's Bethsaida over on the other side. This is where we had the feeding of the 5,000, right? Here's the little bit of the water that they went through. This is where Jesus walked on the water. They got out here 3 miles out in the middle of the lake, right? So that's there. You see Nazareth over here. This is where Jesus grew up, right? So nearby, here's Tiberias here. This is where Herod lives, okay? Now, here is Tyre and Sidon, okay? So Jesus, again, when in last week's lesson, he left the land of Israel, which is really from the Sea of Galilee downward. Jerusalem is down at the bottom of this map. And he went north up into Gentile territory, up to Tyre and Sidon, which are here on the coast of the Mediterranean Sea. Now, if we read here in Mark, did I read it or not? In Mark chapter 7, verse 31, right? It says he left Tyre and Sidon. He came through the midst of the region of the Decapolis to the Sea of Galilee. You'll see that the Decapolis is actually down here on the bottom right, right? The Decapolis means 10 cities. So there were 10 cities in this area, and they were part of what was known as the Decapolis. So Jesus comes to Sidon, goes to Tyre, goes to Sidon, and then somehow crosses over these mountains, goes down on the east side of the Sea of Galilee into the Decapolis, and is probably somewhere in this area around what's called Hippos here, when we're talking about what we're going to see today, right? Because at the end of the lesson, we'll see that he gets in a boat and crosses the Sea of Galilee over to a little city called Magada, which is over here north of Tiberias. Now, the other thing, just to complete the story, so we one of the things I said last time was that he went up here to Tyre and Sidon, and then he went back to Galilee. He did not. He spent all this time over here in the Gentile area. Even the Decapolis is also Gentile area. Really, you have to get west of the Jordan at this point in the map to be into Israel. So all this over here, Galilee, Samaria, that's all of Israel. But over here, Decapolis and all these other names are really part of the Gentile area. So in the story today, he is in a Gentile area. The healings that we're going to see, the feeding of the 4,000 is in a Gentile area as compared to the feeding of the 5,000, which was in Bethsaida. Although this is, you might say, that's more of a Gentile area. That was mostly the Jews who came from Capernaum, if you remember, around the lake to meet him at Bethsaida for the feeding of the 5,000. So one of the things I said last week was this was really the only time that he was up in Gentile territory, but not true. The whole thing that we're going to see today, he was still in Gentile territory. He did not zoom back into Israel. Now he does, as I said, in a minute, he crosses over the sea, gets to Magada, but that again is not the last time he's in Gentile, because we'll see in chapter 16, he goes to Caesarea Philippi, which on your map is up here, again, north of the Sea of Galilee, again in Gentile territory. And one thing we'll understand is that when we see the transfiguration of Jesus, it actually occurs up here in Gentile territory, which is kind of an amazing thing. So we'll get to all that stuff later, but this is just to get you understanding the geography, which I may have confused you with last time. Any questions on this, or if you want to scold me, now's the time. All right, so I'm going to try to close this, go back to this, stop sharing, so you can see my smiling face.
First you have to smile.
There
we go.
It's as good as I do. All right. So I want to stay there in Mark chapter 7 a minute and actually read this story in Mark chapter 7, verse 31 and following. This was also during this trip, right? He leaves Tyre and Sidon and he goes to Decapolis. During this time, this incident occurs, which is parallel to what we'll see happens back in Matthew. So let's read through this. Verse 32 says, Then they brought to him one who was deaf and had an impediment in his speech, and they begged him to put his hand on him. So this is not unusual in these days. If you were deaf, you also had an impediment of speech, because you could not hear. It was difficult for you to speak. So most of the time when scripture talks about someone being deaf, they're also dumb in this sense. So verse 33, and he took him aside from the multitude, put his fingers in his ears, back, and touched his tongue. Then looking up to heaven, he sighed and said to him, Epaphtha, that is, be opened. Immediately, notice that word again, we're going to come back to it, but immediately his ears were opened, the impediment of his tongue was loosed, and he spoke plainly. Which, the miracle, not only that he healed his ears, but the miracle that someone who could not hear, has never heard, can all of a sudden speak and can speak the language, is the miracle on top of the miracle, right? He spoke plainly. Verse 36, then he commanded them that they should tell no one, but the more he commanded them, the more widely they proclaimed it. And they were astonished beyond measure, saying, he has done all things well. He makes both the deaf to hear and the mute to speak. One thing that's interesting here, before we go back to Matthew, it says, they were astonished beyond measure. In all the times when Jesus was healing people in the Israelite community, it says, and the people were astonished, or the people wondered, right? But here they're not only astonished, they're astonished beyond measure. It's again the receptiveness of the Gentiles. This is the Gentile again. We're in the Decapolis. Who is healed here is astonished beyond measure. All right, let's go back to Matthew now. Let's pick up the story as we have it there in Matthew. So we'll again read verse 29. Jesus departed from there, skirted the Sea of Galilee, and went up in the mountain and sat down there. Verse 30, then great multitude came to him, having with them the lame, blind, mute, maimed, and many others, and they laid them down at Jesus' feet, and he healed them. So first of all, the great multitudes came to him. So again, he's in the Decapolis. He's in this Gentile area. If you remember from our reading last week, it said back in chapter 4 that many from the Decapolis had come to see him, back in the area that he already was in, when he was in Israel, when he was in Capernaum. A lot of people, excuse me, a lot of people from the Decapolis had already heard about him, known about him. So now when Jesus comes into this area where he's not been before, the people there already know about him, already heard, and this multitude then gathers. It's not surprising that this multitude gathers there. I mean, he's not very far from his home base, and these people have heard about him before. And it says, and they came to him, having with them the lame, the blind, the mute, the maimed, and many others. Now, we know about most of these folks, the lame, the blind, the mute, many others, but the maimed is a different word we've done before. It really, the way that word is used in other places in the language of the time was really someone who was missing a limb, right? Someone who did not have an arm or a leg or did not have an eye, right? They were missing something. So the maimed and many others. So all these people then, and they laid him down at Jesus' feet, and he healed them. What's interesting is that, again, the Greek word for they laid him down is more like they threw him. They threw these people. That it was a crowd just quickly putting people at Jesus' feet, You can just think of hundreds and hundreds of people being placed at his feet, and him immediately healing all of them. It's the picture of this is just fascinating, really, to think about all of this going on. Hundreds of people, the multitudes of this crowd, bringing with them all of their friends who are lame, blind, mute, maimed, and having other things, laying them down. These people are being healed. It says he healed them. Some who did not have limbs all of a sudden had limbs. Those who couldn't hear all of a sudden could hear and could speak. The drama of this miracle is very high. Verse 31, so the multitude marveled. Yeah, they did. They marveled when they saw the mute speaking, the maimed were made whole, the lame walked, the blind seeing, and they glorified the God of Israel. Now notice here that it says they glorified the God of Israel. Again, when we see healings in other places where it's a Jewish community, it just says they glorified God. But here, because we're in a Gentile community, it says they glorified the God of Israel, right? Because these people would be worshiping other gods. But here they are recognizing it's the God of Israel that is responsible for the healings that they're seeing in front of them. So Jesus sees this great multitude. They're coming to him. They're all being healed. This happens over 3 days. For 3 days, he's there. People are coming. He's healing them, multitudes of people over and over, and the crowd is glorifying God. So then we go on to verse 32. Yeah. Okay. Now Jesus called the disciples to himself and said, I have compassion on the multitude because they have now continued with me 3 days and have nothing to eat. And I do not want to send them away hungry, lest they faint on the way. So again, the crowd is there. They've been there 3 days. They've been involved in all this healing that's going on, but no one has taken time to go back to town and get some food. And Jesus says that He has compassion. Now, we're going to see here the feeding of the 4,000. And one of the questions that comes up is, well, wait a minute. We just saw the feeding of the 5,000. Is this just a repeat of that story, or is this a different group, right? Is Matthew stuttering here? He's just repeating the same story over and over again. And what we're going to show you in the context is that there are several things that are very different from the two stories, and also make it clear that this is a Gentile group. But in all honesty, the thing that makes it the most clear, if you go to chapter 16 for a moment and look at chapter 16, verse 9, Jesus is here reproving the disciples, and he says, "Do you not yet understand or remember the 5 loaves and the 5,000 and how many baskets you took up, nor the 7 loaves and the 4,000 and how many large baskets you took up?" Et cetera, et cetera. So Jesus here is referring to the two incidents as separate things, right? There's the feeding of the 4,000 and the feeding of the 5,000. So if Jesus says there's 2 different feedings, I believe there's 2 different feedings. I don't think this is a mistake that somebody made. I don't think this is a translation error. I think there were 2 different occurrences that happened. One where the people in the crowd were primarily Jewish, and one where the people in the crowd were primarily Gentiles, which is fascinating. Right. So Jesus says here again, I have compassion on the multitude. Now, why did Jesus feed these people? He didn't feed these people in answer to a challenge by the Pharisees. He didn't feed these people in this particular case to show him that he was the Messiah. Why did he feed these people?
He had compassion.
Because he had compassion on them. I mean, sometimes sometimes rightly, right? A lot of Jesus' miracles were about showing who he was so that the people would get his message, right? That's absolutely why the miracles are in here. But in this particular case, the reason he performed this miracle was simply because he had compassion on the people, because it broke his heart to see these people who may have to leave and had not had anything to eat and may actually pass out on the way home because they did not have any food. And so Jesus here acts completely out of compassion. And again, it's compassion for folks that were not followers of his, right? We're not even Jews. They're a bunch of Gentiles. He has compassion on them. The other thing is, certainly he has compassion on them, as we've seen in the other text. He compassion on them to heal them because they're sick, because they had demon possessions, etc. He has compassion on them because spiritually they did not, know who he was, etc. We can understand that compassion, but here he has compassion on them for something very simple. They're hungry, right? He has compassion on them because they may faint along the way. What I love about that is it broadens the idea of the compassion of God, right? Yes, he's compassionate for our souls. Yes, he's compassionate about the big things in our lives, but he's also compassionate about our daily food, right? He's compassionate about the little things in our lives. He's paying attention and knows what's going on. And I just appreciate that this whole miracle is just about these people who are hungry and God taking care of them. It does push me to say, what should I have compassion about? What should I respond to? When should I step up and have compassion on people who do not know him and just need food, just need help, just need a hand? Sometimes I think we complain about churches that all they do is social programs, and they don't really worry about the salvation of souls. The opposite is also true. If we only worry about the salvation of souls and we don't worry about helping people, we're not being like Christ either. So just something for your pocket. All right. The other thing in that verse, right, he turns to the disciples and says this, right? He calls his disciples to himself and says, these people need some food. Jesus did not have to do that. He did not have to bring the disciples into this. He could have just snapped his fingers and bam, everybody had a nice plate of food in front of them, right? But he brings the disciples in. Again, it just shows me the heart of him to train up those disciples, to allow them to be a part of this miracle that they're about to experience. And we'll get back to that in a minute. So let's look at verse 33. We see the fun response of his disciples, right? Then his disciples said to him, "Where could we get enough bread in the wilderness to fill such a great multitude?" Now, I want to respond, you blockheads, right? It maybe has been a couple of weeks. I give them some credit that they went up to Tyre and Sidon, went over the mountains, came back down to Decapolis. It's probably not been a couple of days since the feeding of the 5,000, but it certainly hasn't been more than a couple of weeks. And your first response is, oh my gosh, these guys still don't get it, right? They still don't understand. They just saw the feeding of the 5,000. How could they be asking a question about this? But let's give them a little credit, just a little. You notice that they say in this verse, says, "Where could we get enough bread in the wilderness to fill such great multitudes?" So they use the word fill, which takes us back to the feeding of the 5,000, because it ends by saying they were all filled. So they understand that they've got to fill this group. It's not just giving them a snack. But the real focus is on the word we, right? They're admitting we can't do anything about this. We do not have the resources. We are unable to help these people. Again, as we've said before Jesus can do something, we have got to come to the end of our rope. We have got to say, I can't do anything about this situation. I have nothing to offer. I have nothing to bring to the game. I need you to step in and help. And I think this is partly what is going on. Partly it's the disciples being dinglings, but partly I think it's the disciples recognizing they have nothing to bring to the game. And they are totally dependent upon what Christ can do here. All right, verse 34. Jesus said to them, "How many loaves do you have?" And they said, 7 and a few little fish, which is kind of funny in itself. He only asked them how much bread they have, but they answered, well, we have loaves and a few fish. They do remember what happened last time, right? It was about loaves and fishes. So again, in verse 35, he says, "So he commanded the multitude to sit on the ground," very likely similar to what we did back with the feeding of the 5,000, in groups so that they could be ministered to. And then verse 36, "And he took the 7 loaves and the fish, and he gave thanks, broke them, and gave them to his disciples, and the disciples gave them to the multitude." So again, this is the miracle of creation here. He's creating food. He's creating loaves. He's creating fish. The first thing he does, don't miss, right? He gives thanks to God. By the way, he gives thanks before the miracle, right? He gives thanks before God acts. He thanks God for what is going to happen. He thanks God for what God is going to do, not afterwards. He breaks the bread. He gives them to the disciples. The disciples then go out and give them to the multitude. So the disciples are right smack in the middle of this creative miracle, seeing it happen, participating in it. It's got to be an amazing growth opportunity for them to see that happening. So verse 37, "They all ate and were filled, and they took up 7 large baskets full of fragments that were left." So that's interesting. In the feeding of the 5,000, they brought up 12 baskets, and here there's only 7 baskets. What is important, however, is the word baskets here is actually different from the baskets that we saw in the feeding of the 5,000. If you remember in the feeding of 5,000, it said that they filled these baskets, and we said those baskets were the little carry baskets that everybody had, a little basket that they would carry their food in. They would strap it around their waist, right? That's the kind of basket there. These baskets are actually Gentile baskets, right? Those are Jewish baskets. These are Gentile baskets. It says in my translation, large baskets. This basket is the same basket that was used to lower Paul over the wall in Damascus to let him down when he was in trouble. So this is a big basket, more maybe a hamper would be more like. It's a big basket that they would store food in, not one that they would carry around with them. So actually the amount of food that's left over here is much larger than what we had from the feeding of the 5,000 with these 7 baskets. And again, it shows that this is a Gentile group, not a Jewish group, because they had Gentile baskets with them. Verse 38, now those who ate were 4,000 men, besides women and children. So again, with the women, with the children, you're probably talking 15,000, 20,000 people that are actually fed here. In verse 39, he sent away the multitude, got into a boat, and came to the region of Magdala. So again, this is, as we showed in the map, he was on the east coast over by the Decapolis. Now he's going back to the west coast to Magdala. And we'll see that the events in chapter 16 occur there as the Pharisees jump back into the game and start giving him trouble again. So I just want to back up from the story and with these 2 stories, these 2 feedings, and just kind of remind you of a few of the lessons that we've learned as we've gone through these miracles, both the great healings and this feeding of the 4,000. The first thing is no question about seeing the power of Christ and recognizing it as divine power, right? Because this is creating power. He's creating bread. He's creating fish. He's creating limbs. He's creating eyes. He's creating arms. He's creating new tongues. I mean, this is no question. You're seeing in this the power of Christ. It's showing that he is God, that he's divine. The second thing I would say, and I mentioned it when we were reading the story in Mark, is that it gives you a real understanding of what healing was like in those days, right? It was immediate. It was complete. It was not like these false healers today who say, yeah, you're going to be better. Just wait a couple of days. Or, you had a cough and now you don't have a cough. No, these guys didn't have arms. And now all of a sudden they have arms. These people had demons and the demons were gone. These people had no fish and all of a sudden there's fish there, right? One thing about healing that one of the commentaries said that I thought was good is that, healing has not stopped today, but healers have stopped. Jesus is the only healer, but healing has continued, and it's continued through doctors and those others that have those skills. But faith healers, there is not one since Christ was here. The other thing I'll mention as far as lessons go is the results of ministry is worship, right? They glorified the God of Israel. We saw that over and over. We see the result of ministry is worship of God. We also see here the recognition of their lack of resources of the disciples, right? They got the poor in spirit. We cannot do this. When you realize you cannot do it, then God can work. And when we do realize it, then he does work, right? They were filled. His supply of fish and bread was infinite, right? He could have fed 100,000. His supply is never diminished. I do want to have you turn here for a minute to Luke chapter 6 to remind you of this verse, because there's another piece of this that's important. Luke chapter 6, verse 38. Says, give and it will be given to you, good measure, pressed down, shaken together, running over, will be put into your bosom. For with the same measure that you use, it will be measured back to you. We think about Christ, that he has infinite resources to feed these people. He also says that we will have infinite resources to do his work, right? So don't miss that part. We will have infinite resources as we rely on him, as we allow him to work through us. We have infinite resources to do the work that he wants us to do. That's just a reality we don't grab onto enough. That we have all the resources of Christ to do what Christ wants us to do. The next one, I would just say that, again, he works through people, right? He works through the disciples. God creates, but the disciples deliver. God's doing this miracle through those disciples, using them as the hands and feet who actually, who actually hand the bread and fish to the people. He allows us to participate in his miracle work. He allows us to participate in his miracle work. Wow. He didn't have to do that. He could just save the people he wants to save, but he allows us to talk to them. He allows us to give them the word. He allows us to participate in salvation. I think I've said this before, but God also gives liberally, right, till they were filled. He gives to us pressed down and running over. It's liberal. It's overflowing. Also recognize again, the disciples did not eat until everyone else did, right? They had to invest in the people. They had to do the ministry before they got what they needed. They didn't get anything until everything was given away. They didn't get anything until everything was given away. And then they got. And then take us back to the first lesson, and that is God's compassion, right? It's not just about the spiritual things, not just about the big things, but the daily needs. And the daily needs to those who are outside the faith. This, again, is a Gentile community. They were there for the miracles. They were there not knowing all of the information about the kingdom. And God still has compassion on them and feeds them and takes care of them. That is all. Did I do enough mea culpa about my mistakes? Will you forgive me for being not doing enough homework? And I am serious, though, for those of you who may have picked up on it and didn't tell me, please don't do that again. Let me know when I stumble. It's important. All right. Anything else on this lesson?
Just a question about the way Jesus performed these miracles. A lot of the big miracles, early miracles, I guess the ones that were done individually, he says that it was their faith that caused them to be healed. But here in a group this large, was he was just healing them out of his compassion. He was giving them mercy without their having faith or really knowledge of him until they saw the miracles.
Yeah. And as I said earlier, many of his miracles, the whole point of them was so that they would understand who he was, so that they would receive the message. So absolutely, Rick, it wasn't because of their faith that they got healed. They got healed so that they would recognize who he was, right? In this particular case, they got healed because he was just overflowing with compassion and he healed them. Not that there was any expectation in this particular case. So yeah, it's not because of their faith, because of who he is. He just decided. Anything else? Good one. All right, prayer requests. Let's go there. As far as we are concerned, I'll say that I still hear a child crying upstairs, which means sleep has not happened. So you can. I'll probably have to leave here and go help. So let's just go around the room now. Hugh, what you got?
You.
Oh, okay.
You can turn off
Somebody
the
said to
recording.
return off recording. Unless they want to listen to our